first off, we're going to go into the early prison system. So the prison system of today in the United States is considered a hot button issue. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to start talking about the early days of it. So the first prison in America was founded in 1790 by the Pennsylvania Quakers. They were searching for a form of punishment that was less cruel and brutal than the dungeon prisons and jails and workhouses. So they created a place where prisoners could read scripture and repent. They thought this would reform the prisoners. Over time, it grew in different ways of use and construction, beginning first in the Jacksonian era. This was a era that imprisoned and rehabilitative labor really started to become a popular form of criminal punishment. After the Civil War and really gaining the momentum during the progressive era of America, the new concepts were introduced. Parole, intermittent sentencing, and probation. This quickly became mainstream. This is due to the large crime wave that happened after the Civil War. The large crime wave that happened was as a result of soldiers that were unemployed. Officials decided to be tougher on crime and became a more retribution-based form of punishment rather than rehabilitative. After the crime waves went down, they began to focus more on the rehabilitation aspect of prison life. The final wave was in the 1970s. Both federal and state has experienced huge amounts of expansions. Also began the privatized prison system rather than the government controlled. Since 1973, the number of incarcerated persons in the United States has increased fivefold, and in a given year, about 7 million people were under supervision or control of the U.S. Correctional Services. You need to understand that the prison system is always changing with the different times and changes in society as well as in science, mainly psychological aspects of it. A large number of British settlers were considered criminals. Even at the very beginning, even at the very beginning, there has been a form of prison system, even in the old colonies, very similar to what they had in the UK, in the United Kingdom. Some more early history during the Jacksonville period faced major overcrowding and understaffing issues from prison officials reverted to the amazingly bizarre methods of controlling their charges. Here are some forms of punishment that were common during that time period. One was the pulley or tying up system. This was where inmates were suspended by their wrist, fastened over their head, up to an hour. At Sing Sing in New York, it was extremely popular. Some men have even been kept raised so long as to cause bleeding from their mouth before a doctor would order the inmates down. Also used was a variation of the pulleys known as hooks, which involved tying inmates' hands together and lashing them to a wall at chest height and forcing them to put most of their weight onto their toes. That was one form. Excuse me a second. The iron cup or cage. Inmates wore a case composed of small rods or bands of iron which weighed between 6.5 and 8 pounds around their neck, and an iron band across their neck and shoulders held it in place. Another one was the lash and paddle. This form continued into the post-war era, with some refinement, of course. Weighted leather strips and aerated paddles were used instead of whips. The number of strokes was set to the offense, and in some places like Massachusetts, limited by stature. Sing Sing convicts in the 1880s reportedly jumped from upper galleries of the prison cells cell blocks in an effort to break their legs in an effort to escape the paddling aspect. That's how cruel it was. So basically, they were like, you know what? I'm going to go to the very top of this prison system that I can, and I'm going to try to break my legs, because if I do that, then they won't paddle me. I mean, people, that's how extreme it was. Now, another one that came, and this is something that they still use today, only not as graphic, was solitary confinement, the dungeon. During the Reconstruction era, inmates were locked in dark solitary cells, furnished only with a bucket and fed short rations for disciplinary infractions, usually for a period up to a week, but sometimes, back in the day, was up to 6 months or more straight. Which brings me on to another form, which is straitjackets. Wardens used them as much for discipline as well as for inmate safety. Brick bag. Convicts who would not work were forced in some institutions to wear a heavy bag full of weighted objects. 7 was a water crib. Used at the Reconstruction era prisons like in Kansas, this disciplinary instrument involved the inmates being placed in a coffin-like box about 6.5 feet long, 30 inches wide, and 3 feet deep. The inmate would lie face down, his or her hands cuffed behind their back, while keepers slowly filled the crib with water to stimulate drowning. So, wardens tended to believe that these measures were necessary to keep control of the prison. Contemporary observers at the time generally found them unquestionably cruel and unusual. Now, northern states continued to lease the labor of convicts to private business interests in the post-war years. The 13th Amendment, adopted in 1865, expressly permitted slavery as a punishment for a crime where the parties shall have been duly convicted for what they did. The state generally fed and housed inmates. Contractors brought all the necessary machineries to the prison facility, and then they leased the inmates' times to these people. So abuses were common, according to investigative reports. The employers and guards tried to extract as much time and effort from inmates as possible. There is a case in New Jersey at a prison in Trenton where an inmate died while being stretched by prison staff. The officials had poured alcohol on the wounds and set them on fire to see if he was simply faking convulsions in order to skip work that day. In Ohio, penitentiaries, unproductive inmates were made to sit naked in puddles of water and receive shocks from induction coils. In New York, in the 1840s through the 1870s, prisoners had been poisoned to death for not working. The inmates were kept chained to the floor for about 10 months in solitary confinement until they eventually suffered a mental breakdown. During the 1870s, as many as 3 million immigrants arrived on the shores of the United States. By the 1880s, the influx rose to 5.2 million as immigrants fled Europe. The trend continued until it reached a zenith between 1904 and 1914 of 1 million people a year. In the 1850s and the 1860s, prisons, along with the insane asylums for the mentally ill, were becoming the special preserve of foreign-born and the poor. This trend accelerated as the 19th century drew to a close. In Illinois, for example, 60% of inmates in 1890 were foreign-born, or second-generation immigrants, Irish and Germans mostly. Less than 5% had a high school or college education. The great majority was held unskilled or semi-skilled jobs. In California, 45% of prisoners were foreign-born. Predominantly Chinese, Mexican, Irish, and German inmates filled up California prisons. Majority were laborers, waiters, cooks, or farmers. Throughout the post-war years, the rate of imprisonment for foreign-born Americans were twice that of the native-born ones. African Americans were incarcerated north and south at a rate of about 3 times the rate of a white American. Also, the Civil War ends also witnessed the emergence of pseudoscientific theories concerning biological superiority and inherited social inferiority, social class concepts of survival of the fittest. This was a form of Darwinism. Such thoughts, like by Charles Coring Brace, warned his readers that attempts to cure poverty through charity would backfire by leasing the poor's chance. It would basically lessen the poor's chance of survival. Richard L. Dougal, civil-minded merchant of New York, toured 13 county jails during the 1870s as a voluntary inspector for the prestigious Prison Association of New York. He traced crime to heredity, criminal, and promiscuity. These views on race and genetics affect the various official supervisory bodies established to monitor regulatory compliance in the United States prison systems. I really do not want to go into that much about pseudo-race science at this time. However, I will say by the late 1880s, eugenics programs were enjoying a full-blown renaissance in American prisons and institutions for the mentally ill, with leading physicians, psychologists, and wardens as their proponents as the field of physical anthropology gained traction in the 1880s. Prisons became laboratories for studying eugenics, psychologically, human intelligence, medicine, drug treatment, genetics, and birth control. In the 1910s, Rockefeller created the Bureau for Social Hygiene, which conducted experiments on female prisoners. With the state's consent, of course, and financial support, to determine the roots of the criminality and mental defectiveness. So the Reconstruction era came from a variety of sources. Fears about genetic contamination by the criminal class, and in its effects on the future of mankind, led to numerous moral policing efforts aimed at curbing promiscuity, prostitution, and white slavery in this time period. In this period of time. So, we're about to go into kind of the what I call the Godfather aspects of the past Me Too movements, Basically, it's kind of like my little cliff note on that. Campaigns to criminalize domestic violence, especially towards children, and related temperance movements. When legislators ignored demands for more protection for women and children, feminist activists lobbied for harsher punishments for male criminal offenders, including the whipping post, castration, and longer prison terms for males. Interestingly enough, some prison reformers, Enoch Wines, Franklin, Sanborn, Theodore Dwight, and Zebulon Brockway, among others, they justified penitentiaries for negative reasons, that a successful attack on the prison system and its fillings might yield a return to barbarism of colonial era punishments. The National Congress, the Declaration of Principles. The object of the new system, based on Sir Walter Crofton, an Irish market system. Is basically an Irish mark system is what it's called. However, so this is the declaration that he was trying to draw based on, he wanted to do a declaration for a better form of punishment. He wanted to base it off the Irish mark system, which was created by Sir Walter Crofton. because in Ireland they had like really good score marks for their prisoners. So this declaration called for sanitary improvements and end to the political appointment of prison administrators. It welcomed the increased participation of women in prison management, meaning, proper female authority. Advocated for a more progressive system of classifying prisoners based on individualized and continuous assessments of their character through the mark system. Number 4 was it stressed the importance of inducting inmates. Number 5 was it argued that prisoners' wills must be won over via persuasion, not destroyed. The National Congress and these who responded to its agenda also hoped to implement a more open-ended sentencing code. These suggestions for penal reform anticipated the near comprehensive adoption and intermediate sentencing during the progressive era. Even though there were efforts of penal reform, the National Congress generally subscribed to the prevailing contemporary notion that African Americans and foreigners were disproportionately represented in the prison system due to their inherent depravity and social inferiority. They're basically saying they can't help but be criminals because it's part of their genetics. This goes back to the pseudoscience that we were talking about earlier. Elmire administration underscores the fundamental tension of contemporary penal reform, according to authors Scott Christian and David Rothman. On one hand, its purpose was to rehabilitate offenders. On the other hand, its reform principles were tempered by a belief inheritable of basically the genetics of the criminal behavior. Elmire Prison first warden, National Congress member Zebulon Brockway, wrote in 1884 that at least one half of his charges were incorrigible due to their genetics. He further characterized modern criminals as to be to a considerable extent the product of our civilization and of immigration to our shores from the less civilized populations of crowded European marts. Brockway reserved the harshest disciplinary measures. He was fond of frequent whippings and solitary confinement for those he deemed incorrigibly, primarily the mentally and the physically disabled. You got to keep in mind that this guy was considered like the best one, that he was like the best warden of one of the best prisons, but yeah, he was still just as cruel as what prior wardens were. Now, this next section is kind of being thrown off a little bit. Like I told you, this is meant to be put in different parts as like per bono. For the past month, I've been fighting this infection, so I apologize if you hear coughing occasionally or what have you. That's the reason why it's been so hard. I've been fighting this sickness, man. Now, this covered a little bit about the North, okay? So, we're going to move on a little bit about the South. In the South, meanwhile, after the Civil War, African Americans were not allowed to be jurors. The Ku Klux Klan started policing neighborhoods. For their part, former slaves in the Reconstruction era South and made efforts for their own counteract white supremacist violence and injustices that were going on. In March 1886, Abraham Weinfeld and other black men petitioned the head of the Corgine Freedmen's Bureau for relief from the oppression of the brewery courts in Savannah, Georgia, especially for Civil War veterans. In rural areas like Greene County, Georgia, African Americans met vigilante violence from whites with violence of their own. Southern courts were largely unable, even They were unwilling to bring whites to justice for violence against black Southerners. By the mid 1870s, white political supremacy had been established anew across most of the South. A different form of violence emerged in the post war years. Race riots erupted in southern cities almost immediately after the war and continued for years after that. Whites resented the labor competition from African Americans in the depressed post war southern economy, and police forces, many were composed or were reconstructed Southerners, often resorted to violence. This created a vacuum power struggle between whites and African Americans. For power, blacks ultimately lost this struggle, however. Convict leasing practice in the convict leasing programs were the norm for the earliest of days of the penitentiary movement was taken up by southern states in the earliest following the American Civil War. In 1885, National Survey reported that 138 institutions employed over 53,000 inmates in industries who produced goods valued at $28.8 million. They were valued at $28.8 million after the Civil War. You gotta think about the economy now. That's huge. Although the South realized it is only a small sum in comparison to the estimated $5.4 billion in goods produced by free labor in 1880, which is during the Civil War, they decided prison labor was big business. The convict lease program, as practiced in the South, was an attempt by state governments to basically resurrect slavery in a justified way. The lease system was useful for capitalists who wanted to make money quickly. Labor costs were fixed and low, and labor uncertainty was reduced to a vanishing point. Convicts could be and were driven to the point free laborers would not tolerate and could not drink or misbehave. In Alabama, 40% of convict leases died during their term of labor in 1870, as an example. The officials who ran the South's leasing operations tried to maintain strict racial separation in the convict camps, refusing to recognize social equality between races, even among felons. Whites who did end up in southern prisons, according to Edward L. Ayers, were considered the lowest of the race, even lower than African Americans. Legislators referred to white persons with the same racial epithets reserved for African Americans at the time. A former warden described how men in Georgia work camps were hung by their thumbs as a form of punishment, to the point that their thumbs become so stretched and deformed to the length of the index fingers that they resembled the paws of certain apes. Even into 1923, prisoners, even if sick, were forced to work under threat of beating or shooting. Things were so bad at the work camps in the South and conditions and treatment that in the 1960s, an Oregon judge refused to return escapees from an Arkansas work camp. And people, this was in the 1960s, by the way, who had been apprehended in his jurisdiction. He declared returning the prisoners would make his state compliant in what he described as institutions of feral, horror, and even despicable evil, which he compared to Nazi concentration camps. Penal farms, the rate of staff to inmates was 1 staff members for every 65 inmates. An example, the physician who ran the farms for the Prophet Blood Bank earned between $130,000 and $150,000 per year off of inmate donations that they sold to hospitals. All right, so now that we have an understanding of early prisons, let's look at modern prisons. The reason why I say that is always say you have to have an understanding of the past before you can have an understanding of the modern aspects of it. Now, originally I wanted this to be in 3 parts. It was going to be what we just did, the prison system, modern prison system, and then interviews. So like I said before, I've been having a hard time getting a hold of some interviews. And like I said, I kind of feel like that's a given. Now, when I think back on it, so even in the 1960s, I really stuck that out to you because that wasn't that long ago when you think about it, in the 1960s. And it was so bad in the South work camps that he compared it to Nazi concentration camps. The point that I'm trying to make here is even still they're adopting prisons. But the idea for prisons, was started as a religious thing. The word penitentiary, for example, actually came from finding penance. Finding penance was like when you pray and you're forgiven, you find God, you found penance. And that's what the word penitentiary was originally meant to be. Now, what basically, as you could tell, what happened both in the North and the South was they kind of backed up a little bit and said, hey, wait a minute. We can make a lot of profit here because we could pay these guys chump change and we can make them work their butts off, which means we could be making a ton of money off of them. And that's really what made them go from the original Quaker idea of a prison back to the workhouse, or i.e. work camps, and controlled sectors, meaning privatized prisons, state prisons. They basically went back on the idea of housing them to sleep and feeding them and working them. That's kind of what their idea kind of went back to. And I really want you to think about this. Modern prisons has that much changed. Granted, they can't be forced to work, I'm assuming, if they don't want to. I'm sure there's some form of punishment for it. And that's why I wanted to do interviews with people. We'll find that out later because I'm still hoping to do that at a future date. However, I don't think that much has really changed per se, because I do know that a lot of people have reestablished the aspects of work camps, or i.e. men camps. So I don't really want to say that much has changed per se. I think it's just been modernized, and we're going to find that out here in a minute, why I feel that way. However, as I always say before, I have never been locked up in prison. I have seen the inside of a jail cell. I'll just put it like that, but never a prison cell. But I do have numerous friends of mine that have been locked up off and on, and I've heard their personal testimonies for what's life like, and I don't want to speak for them without them giving me permission to. So, I will say that I think that after I get done with the modern concept of it, I'm sure most people will agree with me that we need to have a new look at that, how we're treating inmates and the prison system overall, because I think the prison system is failing. And I know that a lot of politicians will say it's not based on the fact that they're making so much money off of it profit-wise. And if that's your end goal, to make profit and money off of it, then sure, it's not failing. But if your idea is to rehabilitate them to be better citizens when they come out of prison, then you would be failing them, because you're teaching them nothing but harsher punishments, violence, and they learn how to be better criminals. I'm going to go into that later. However, I just wanted to do this real quick because I'm running out of time. As you could tell, so to sum it up, things were effed up back in the early prison system because they were able to do whatever they want. Hanging people up by their thumbs, weighing them down and making them stand on their toes, on the very edge of their toes, until they would break. It's kind of like Guantanamo Bay. was, you know? So that's how I feel about that. You know what? I say let's go for it. Let's try to see if I can fit it into this. So, the United States has the largest prison population in the world and the highest per capita incarceration rate. In 2016, there were 655 people incarcerated per 100,000 population. In 2008, approximately 1 in every 31 adults, 7.1 million in the United States, were either behind bars or mismonitored, probation or parole. In recent decades, the U.S. has experienced a surge in its prison population, quadrupling since 1980 due to the mandatory sentencing that came about during the war on drugs. As of 2007 census of juveniles in residential placement, 86,927 youths were held in juvenile facilities. As of 2005, an estimated that 27% of the federal prison inmates are non-citizens of the United States, convicted of crimes while in the country illegally or illegally. However, federal prison inmates only account for about 6% of the total incarceration population. Many legislation continually have reduced the discretion of judges in both the sentencing process and the determination of whether the conditions of a sentence have been satisfied. As a consequence of the three strike laws, the increase of duration of incarceration of the last decade was most pronounced in the case of the life of the prison sentence, which increased by 83% between 1992 and 2003, while violent crimes fell in the same period. In 2016, there were an estimated of 1.2 million violent crimes committed in the United States. Over the course of that year, U.S. law enforcement agencies made approximately 10.7 million arrests, excluding the arrests for traffic violations. In that year, approximately 2.3 million people were incarcerated in a jail or prison. 52.4% of sentenced prisoners in state prisons at the year end of 2008 were in for violent crime. From 2000 to 2008, the state prison population increased by 159,200 prisoners, and violent offenders accounted for only 60% of this increase. The number of drug offenders in the state prisons declined by 12,400 over this period. Among unconvicted inmates in jails in 2002, 34% had a violent offense as the most serious charge. 41% of convicted or unconvicted jail inmates in 2002 had a current or prior violent offense. 46% were nonviolent revisits. In 2010, inmates in adult facilities by race and ethnicity, jails, and state and federal prisons. So, Caucasian was U.S. population 64%, U.S. incarcerated population 39%. National incarcerated rate was 450 per 100,000. Hispanic 16, U.S. incarcerated population 19. National incarcerated 831 per 100,000. African American U.S. population 13. U.S. incarcerated population 40. National incarcerated rate 2,306 per 100,000. So, let's look at this real quick. So, there's different security levels. Supermax facilities provide the highest level of prison security. Their units hold up those considered the most dangerous inmates, as well as inmates that were deemed to be high profile or too great a national security risk for a normal prison. Maximum security prison, or area called high security in the federal system. All prisoners have individual cells with sliding doors controlled by a secure remote control station. Prisoners are allowed out of their cells for 1 out of 24 hours. 1 hour and 30 minutes for prisons in California. Closed security. Prisoners usually have 1 or 2 people in a cell, operated from a remote control station. Each cell has its own toilet and sink. Inmates may leave their cells for work assignments or correctional programs, and otherwise may be allowed in a common area in the cell block or exercise yard. Medium security group may sleep in cells, but since them two and two were used bunks with lockers to store their possessions. The cell may have showers, toilets, and sinks, but it's not a strictly enforced rule. Minimum security are considered to pose little physical risk to the public and are mainly nonviolent, white-collar criminals. Minimum security prisoners live in less secure dormitories, which are legally patrolled by correctional officers. And normally this is where I would go into my actual questionnaire that I have for people. So, I don't know how long I have before they give me my warning here. So, let me just put it like this. That was a really fast, I was going through study material pretty fast there. The reason for this is, when you talk about modern prison days, a lot of times you're going to get what I call race-baiting questions. Or race-baiting opinions. And I'm not about that. Because I generally feel like that they need to redesign how they're doing it. Because in a way, they've kind of designed it to be pro-segregation. For instance, they say for safety reasons, they will put an African-American with another African-American. They will put a Mexican-American with a Mexican-American, or i.e. Hispanic. Asian with another Asian, a Native with another Native, white with another white. I think that's counterproductive because you're allowing the hatred to grow. I understand the need for it in a way, and then again, I don't. I'm also in favor of work camps coming back, not in a way that they were in the past. However, I do feel that will give inmates for certain yards, like if I go back and look through my notes, like for the minimum security or medium security, I feel like that would give the inmates hope and teach them a skill that they could carry over when they get released. So I'm in favor of work camps. I don't think they should be driven like slaves. I don't. I think they should at least, get whatever dollar amount is fair to go in a commissary. I also feel like, that a lot of people have messed up a lot of things, For instance, cigarettes wasn't always illegal in prisons until they started using stuff to riot. That messed it up for everybody. So, in a lot of ways, the prison system has come from barbaric to what they call civilized. And I did, yes, it is civilized. However, how civilized is it in reality? Because how many times have you heard the saying, the problem with jails are they're so nice they come back twice? There's a lot of places with a lot lower crime rate and a lot more fucked up prison systems. For instance, a lot of the prison system in Puerto Rico is ran by prisoners. You know what I mean? In Africa, it's ran by prisoners. Nobody wants to run it. It's too dangerous, so they just run it. And the result of that is a lot of people would rather die than get locked up because of what they experience in there. So, I'm in favor of us changing the prison system. I think we need to change it based on not pseudoscience. I think we need to change it based on principles. I think we need to I think the prisoners should be allowed to grow. There should be more psychological help for them, more work programs for them, computer programs for them. And I think this should be based on their offenses. For instance, if you're a gang leader, then yeah, you're going to have harsher punishments. If you're a child pedophile, personally, I think you should be dead. Just to be honest. Sorry. You raped a kid. I'm talking about the ones that rape women and children. Abuse them. Yes, I do believe that they should be executed for that crime. Because there's no helping that type of person, in my opinion. Now, with that said, for other offenses such as drugs, yes, absolutely, they need to be treating them like a tech school would treat a disadvantaged youth from a bad neighborhood. give them some work incentives and programs, and then when they get out, they're like, hey man, I went to school and I got my diploma in this, and I've been working my butt off on it, you know? And society really needs to change the way they look at things too, because there's a lot of people out there that get locked up, man, and they really do try to go the right way. You know, they try to look for work, and employers will look at their record and go, ha, I ain't hiring you. Rip up their application. And you know, after this happens, and I'm not trying to give them a justified excuse. I'm just saying, put yourself in somebody's shoes that you're going to try to do your best for society, be the best that you can for yourself and for your loved ones. And then you're going to go out every day and you're going to look for work. And every day you're going out to look for work, you know, and they're ripping up applications, or they're telling you they can't hire you, and you know it's a bullshit answer, and this happens for, like, let's say 4 months straight. What is your mind going to be like after that happens to you? You got to think like that. Don't think about it like as somebody who's never had to go through that. Think about it as somebody who has gone through that. Somebody who has looked for work every day, their tail ends off to try to be the best person that they can be, and this person ain't willing to take a chance on them because they got a criminal record. Now, granted, am I saying that person should get the job over somebody who doesn't have a criminal record, who's been to college and has a clean record? I think it depends on the job. For instance, when I hear that argument, often what I'm thinking is most people that I've known, and I've worked in the food industry for a long time in labor type of jobs, and most of my life in those type of fields of jobs, most of the people have some type of criminal record, with the exception of managers and foremans. So what I'm getting at is that's the type of jobs these guys are trying to go after, or i.e. these women are trying to go after. You know what I'm saying? Because there are certain aspects in society that we should look after, like somebody who has multiple felonies on their record probably shouldn't be trusted to be a doctor or a nurse, in my opinion. Maybe shouldn't be trusted to be a fire. There's just certain things that if it puts the society in danger, I can understand the aspect of it. But I'm talking about give them a chance with jobs such as a security guard with a whistle or a stick, or a guy holding a shovel or a sign on the side of the road, or somebody painting houses. The same jobs that these quote-unquote illegals are getting are jobs that these guys could get and excel at, and maybe have a chance of becoming a better person in society. You know what I mean? It brings me back to another personal story, which I noticed, you'll notice I do that a lot. And one of my buddies, he got out of prison. He had 3 kids. And when he got out, I told him, I'm like, hey man, over here in North Atomas, this store is hiring over here, and over here I was in downtown area, and this store was hiring over here, and it was like, fast food restaurants. He's like, man, I went down there the other day and I ripped up my application. He's like, I tried every day to get a job, and they just keep not doing nothing. It's been like a month, and my baby needs diapers. I don't know what I'm gonna do. He ended up pulling what he calls a lick. In the street, a lick is a crime, and getting relocked back up. But his baby had diapers, so his method, although, is wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm an educated person. I'm not going to sit here and say it wasn't wrong. It was wrong. His justification behind it is heart-wrenching when you think about it. You know what I mean? So I do think that we could fix a lot of it with like the prior episode where I talked about weed legalization. I honestly do feel like by focusing on the rehabilitation, real rehabilitation of inmates, meaning give them education and give them work chances, programs where they can get certified and get something when they get out. Maybe not right away because it's going to take some time, but damn it, they have the certification paperwork, so they have no excuse not to be able to get something because they had this much years of training in it. So say they were locked up for 15 years. That's 15 years of training that they could get if the prison system redoes stuff with the way they think about it. You know what I mean? That would be like that'd be an equivalent of somebody getting a degree at a college. Like, they're not just going to be a laborer. They've gone to school to be a certified laborer and this and that. And I got news for you. A lot of people that are given a chance probably will work harder than most people with the that's never had a record or never lived in a ghetto, has never experienced that, a lot of those people ain't going to work as hard as people that do come from those areas. That's just the fact of life. Because those people from those areas, they don't want to go back to those areas. They don't want to go back to that. So I really wanted to touch bases on that. And this is going to turn out to be one episode instead of 3. And I apologize about that. I over analyzed what I was going to do. A lot of that reason, though, is I haven't gotten as much correspondence as I wanted for that. And I will stop right there to spend a minute to explain that. The reason why I haven't been able to do an interview process for that is I refuse to accept what I call race baiting. So I have a series of questions for people, and if you're out there and you're listening and you have a criminal record, you've been to prison, and you're willing to correspond with me, I do have my official podcast email address attached to my page. Feel free, please, to email me saying, hey, I was locked up. I'd be willing to, spend some time with you, and we can, from an inside perspective. But I do want to put out a disclaimer that my questions are purely based on what I talked about in the podcast. And they're questions designed to what is it really like inside without the aspect of racism. Because I don't want to hear I'm African American, I was treated worse than a white guy. I don't want to hear I'm a white guy, I was treated like I'm an African American. I don't want to hear I'm a Mexican, so I was treated like I was illegal. I don't want to hear race baiting answers. So if you can steer clear of race baiting answers and answer my questionnaire, honestly, for this podcast, I'm going to do a part 2 episode when I get enough people. And there's a total of 13 questions I have. And if you're willing to answer them truthfully, in an educated way, then we can move on from there, and that could be another podcast, and who knows what that could create. Could be some good things for that. So, I really do want to throw that out there. So, and that could be a part 2 episode. This is really just kind of a quick early history and modern prison system and my own kind of spin on it. Because I've seen so many guys really do want to come out and make something of their lives and just not given that chance to. And I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to make excuses for them to continue being a criminal. I'm not. But I do want to say from actual personal experience, I have seen people. I've even had a manager tell me that, and this manager was, at the time, he was working at a Gap store, which is a retail chain. And literally told me that if they've been locked up, he won't hire them. He'll just put their application in the trash. I said, well, he could be one of the best workers you've ever had. He goes, I'd rather hire the person that hasn't had a criminal record. And in one sense, he's saying that he don't want to run the risk of them robbing them or committing a crime on the job. But that's the problem. That's the problem thinking I'm talking about. Because that person could easily go, you know what, I'm done trying. I've tried so hard, I thought this would be a good thing. And you didn't give them a chance. You get what I'm saying? And the numbers just keep increasing instead of decreasing. Really, at a later episode, I will be touching bases on foreign prisons, because if you look at different prisons in other countries, with what they're doing, they make us look like we're shit. Like their prison populations are very low, and they have very low crime rates for reoffenders. Because these places are doing exactly what I was suggesting. They're focusing on the education of the inmates and the psychological aspects. So they're giving them free counseling, psychological, seeing a therapist basically, and working with them on skill sets that they could use when they get out of prison. And as a result of that, they have an extremely low rate of what's called reoffenders. Population of prison inmates, because these guys are getting out with this education and they're like, you know what, there's no reason for me to go back. I got this skill set. I can provide for my family with this. So they're, and guess what, even in their prison system, they have some of the lowest violent acts by inmates in history. And I think it's due to the fact of how they treat their inmates. They're teaching them skill sets, and they're focusing on their mental health. They're focusing on their physical health, and they're focusing on rehabilitating them. They're not forcing them to, but they're focusing on rehabilitation, because some of these prisons I'm talking about, they also have wings that for people that's like, okay, you don't want to, you don't want to change for the better, then you know what, we're gonna throw you over here. And some of these guys see how they're treated over there, like, I don't want that, I'm gonna go with the program. That's what I'm saying. Look at the numbers. Don't look at the short. Look at the long numbers here we're talking about, So you got to think about that. Their whole population, we're talking about inmate population for their whole country, is so low for reoffenders. But yet they do have people that in that category, and those people are sent off to a different type of style of prison, a harsher style, workhouse type of prison, which we covered earlier. But for the ones that are willing to accept the free, seeing a free psychologist and going to counseling and their education and going to the work programs and becoming better people, those people aren't coming back. They're not getting re-locked up. You know what I mean? That's my point, is they're showing the results of that, how they're treating their inmates is so much better than how we treat ours. So again, I'm not trying to sound like a hippie about it. I'm just saying there's facts out there that we should consider. I think that American lawmakers need to re-look at how the American penitentiary system is designed. They need to reanalyze what their goals are, reanalyze how they're going to do it, because I think that we can get rid of a lot of problems. We could provide jobs for Americans that need jobs. There are jobs out there these inmates are willing to do. And a lot of times, yeah, they're the same jobs that illegals want to do. You know what I mean? Because they're willing to do it because they don't want to go back to prison. They don't want to get re-locked up. They don't want to be gone from their families. They want to be able to see their kid at the end of the night if they're given a chance. And again, I'm not saying all of them. I'm saying a good proportion now. So I'm going to end the episode like that. I think we need to just rethink our prison system and rethink how we're doing it. And again, this has been Working Class Thoughts, just average Joe's perspective. So, and again, if you are somebody who's listening and you have been to prison and you're willing to answer a 13 questionnaire and answer it truthfully without focusing on race, if you could do that, please email my show and we will be in touch with you and we will send you the questionnaire. You can remain anonymous, and if you want your name said on the air, I will be willing to do that as well. So your name will be on the air and your personal testimony with it, with the 13 questions. Because part of that will be where I want you to be able to, if you can send out a message to America about how you feel inmates are treated and how you feel that would be benefit to future problems, to be able to fix them, please email our show and let us know. I am willing to work with you on it. We can figure something out to where we can place it onto the show. And again, if you want to remain anonymous, that's personally understandable. You can say what you want us to call you, and that's what we'll call you. So again, email the show and let me know. I'm hoping there's enough people out there that would be willing to want to answer these questions. And again, these 13 questions, I mean, hell, it could help me understand it as well, because this is a lot of research material I went over. It'd be nice to hear from the horse's mouth, per se, like, what was it like for you? And that's what these 13 questions are for. And then there's a whole space to where you can put what your message to America about it would be. But it cannot be racial. So it has to be purely about how you feel Americans treat inmates and prison officials treat inmates as well, and what you think will be benefit to changing that, so we can come out with better numbers, for lesser offenders and less people going back. So once again, everybody have a great day.